It's a great pleasure to welcome Senator Marco Rubio to our first American Legion Department of Florida webinar. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio was first elected to the United States Senate in 2010 and set one objective for himself while in office: to help bring the American dream back into reach of those who feel it slipping away. That's the goal line Senator Rubio strives towards with his every effort and his measure he uses to keep score. Senator Rubio is passionate about the American dream because he's lived it himself. His parents came to America from Cuba in 1956 and earned their way in the middle class by working humble jobs. Through their love and a powerful example, he learned the importance of work and family and developed the belief that all things are possible in America. No more than 2 years into his second term, he continues that important work to make the American dream achievable for all. Senator Rubio is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, where he has advocated for modernizing and reforming the federal government programs to help small businesses grow and succeed in the 21st century economy. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as chairman of the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, transitional crime, civilian security, democracy, human rights, and global women's issues, Senator Rubio continues to fight for human rights and uphold democracy around the globe. Senator Rubio is also a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which provides oversight over the U.S. government's intelligence community and national security apparatus. Additionally, Senator Rubio is a member of the powerful Senate Appropriations Committee, which is responsible for allocating funding for the federal government. Senator Rubio spent most of his life in West Miami and lives there today with his wife, Jeanette, and their 4 children. Prior to being sworn in the Senate in 2010, Senator Rubio served as a city commissioner for West Miami before serving in the Florida House of Representatives from 2000 to 2008. It's my great pleasure to introduce our Senator, Marco Rubio.
Well, thanks for hosting me on this forum. You know, in this very unusual time, there's a lot going on in the country with the pandemic, with protests and everything. And it's been a heck of a year, and we're only halfway through it, you know, so who knows what the rest of 2020 will bring. You know, just as an update on the pandemic issue that we're all talking about, obviously we watch these numbers with concern. In particular, the numbers that we watch very closely are the hospital numbers. Right now, our hospitals are have about 20% capacity overall, which is about in line with what they normally are. The difference is because they've canceled elective surgeries, those other beds are swapped out for COVID patients and the like. And our ICUs are about 15%, that doesn't even count the beds they could convert into ICU. So the numbers are, you know, they're tight, but they're not critical. They're sort of, where they generally are, but you had to cancel elective surgeries to hold those numbers. Where we won't be able to hold those numbers is if, for example, this medicine remdesivir that we have a shortage of in Florida, if we can't get that shipment right, and that's just an issue with the federal government's shipments not getting here on time, then we'll see some of the hospital stays extend, and that would back up these numbers. So we got to keep a very close eye on that and make sure that that gets fixed. You know, it's going to be a challenge between now and the time we have a widely available vaccine, right? And that's not 2 years from now, but it's not 2 weeks from now. So we have to sort of try to do as much as we can in our society and in our lives in that interim period by lowering the risk as much as possible, and also doing a cost-benefit analysis of everything we do. You know, if something has a 5% chance of diminishing the risk of getting the virus, but a 60% chance of destroying the economy, you got to take that into account, you know, when making decisions. And the reverse is true as well. So that's the challenge here. The good news is we are, you know, probably 8 to 12 weeks away from some pretty significant advances that will change things in terms of our options. Rapid testing capabilities that you can even do at home, pool testing where you could test large numbers of people with less tests. The availability, hopefully by the fall at some point, of an additional antiviral or therapeutic that would be even better than remdesivir. They're very close to being able to do that. And there's a lot of optimism that we'll have a vaccine that you could at least begin by using it on those at high risk, the healthcare workers, and then really focusing on that. And there's a real, you know, optimism that we could have one of those in place by the end of this year. Of the 3 major companies that are pursuing it, 2 are now entering stage 3, which is the last stage of the trials. And they're already manufacturing syringes and needles because they know there'll be a huge demand and sort of those being available. And there's a third that's just entering stage phase 2 and could be. So we could have, by the end of the year, we could have 3 vaccines. If you want to be overly optimistic, you can talk about early November as that possibility, and maybe pushing into late October. So those would be big things that happen. You know, we just got to buy ourselves some time to get there. And that's really what we're in the business of doing now. So I tell people, don't cancel things in January and February just yet, because I think we're going to be in a different place, hopefully. You know, we're hoping these things happen. Economically, it's been a real challenge. You know, people were out of work, businesses were closed. And then on top of that, even if you're operating with a lot of restrictions, including customers not wanting to come out. I mean, when you tell people, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but when you tell people, be careful about going out, this virus is running loose, they're not going to go out as much. And on the one hand, that's good, because, right, it slows down the virus. On the other hand, if you're a restaurant owner or somebody like that, it's terrible. It's hurting you bad. And those are jobs attached to that are being hurt. So these are all the things we're kind of juggling at the same time here, and it's a tough one, but we're going to get through it. This isn't forever. There will be an end date here, and we should be in a very different place in a few months, but we got to get there first. And then broader, I mean, I don't recall a modern time in our history in which I probably have to go back to 1968 to find an equivalent period where people were this angry about these many things, you know, and you see it pronounced every day. You know, there isn't a day that goes by that I'm told I can't buy something anymore, or or we've got to stop allowing someone to speak because someone disagrees with their opinion. I mean, it's a very dangerous direction, this cancel culture that we've taken on in the country. You know, some of the anarchy and outrage we saw on the streets that really went well beyond the initial purpose of those marches, and then other people took over and it turned it into something very different. And that level of disorder is not something any society could tolerate. I think we all respect peaceful protest and so forth, and that's one thing. Put that aside, I'm not talking about them. And then I'm talking about people, you know, with Soviet flags and Che Guevara t-shirts, deciding they're going to unilaterally decide what to tear down and what to leave up. So, you know, there's a process for that, and it isn't going out with your friends and getting a chain and pulling something down or spray painting it. So, you know, it's been a tough year. You know, we've had tougher years in our history, that's for sure, but this has been a tough year, and we got some work to do still. So I'm glad I had the chance to talk to you guys about all this. Other than that, it's going real well.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate it. We appreciate your time and everything. I got a few questions for you, if you don't mind, sir.
Yes, sir. Come on.
All right. And this come from polls from different people around the state and stuff like this. We put some things out, and so we took a few questions that concern all of us. Okay. Number one, suicide among veterans remains a critical issue. The American Legion has a program called Project Beverly, which extends financial assistance on a small scale to veterans in need. Project Beverly recently became a suicide prevention initiative in which we partner with other organizations to Dept in prevention of suicide. This partnership includes limited funding to further their research treatment. What types of initiatives are you seeing on both the state and federal level to reduce and eliminate suicides amongst veterans? Would you be willing to partner with the American Legion Department of Florida to seek government funding to assist in funding some of the efforts to proactively reach out at-risk veterans with PTSD have shown positive results and have actually saved lives?
Yeah, a couple things. Two promising things. The first is, you know, when the president's roadmap to empower veterans, call it prevents, and that's good because it really shone a light on this issue. But the latest development is this REACH campaign, which is a campaign to sort of educate all Americans, including veterans, but their families and others, to sort of recognize some of those signs of someone who's experiencing hardship, depression, and then ultimately could potentially take their lives. And then, of course, you know, we're going to be interested in partnering with you to find any sort of federal grants that are available for that effort and others that sort of tackle this issue. It's a complicated issue. You know, suicide is a mental health crisis. We've ironically seen it in veterans, and we're also seeing it in very young Americans. You know, the kinds of people that you think have their future ahead of them and somehow decide that life's not worth living. And these are very troubling things to see, and they're very hard to spot. You know, you may know someone's going through some things, but no one really believes. You know, everyone is shocked when someone commits suicide. You know, that's a common theme, because you say to yourself, I can't believe they did that. You know, and that tells you how hard it is to spot and identify. And it develops very quickly. So absolutely, we would be happy to partner with you to find any federal grants that are available in that regard, and to continue to build on these programs as well.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. Senator, of recent, the American Legion Department of Florida has had an increased number of complaints regarding the VA canceling appointments and not being able to reschedule those same appointments for 4 to 6 months down the road. We all understand COVID is an issue, but we as veterans still need consistent medical care. What do you see as a solution to this issue?
Well, I think part of it, and one of the conversations we're going to be having with the VA, is changing the system by which they're providing the sort of inpatient in-facility care and how they're prioritizing those. You know, at the end of the day, hospitals remain open. The VA is part of the hospital system. Obviously, it has its own share of COVID cases and so forth, but we've seen a very big drop-off in the in-person visits right around the time of the pandemic broke, and they really have not recovered back to those levels. So obviously every region is different. Every region's facing different challenges to their regional area hospital. But I really think part of this is simply systemizing the way you schedule these appointments. And so I think people, if you told someone, you know, you have to wait an extra week for your appointment, they'd much rather have that than be told, we don't know when your next appointment is going to be available. So it really is something that we've already asked them to sort of begin to look at and prioritize in terms of how they queue these up and how they triage them so that the more urgent cases get in the front of the line. And we're hoping to see some systematic changes, and ultimately we're hoping to see the system begin to reopen, you know, and begin to provide that care again. You know, it was a challenge already, so this has made it harder, but it is something we've already inquired about with the secretary.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Another question, sir. In recent decision made by Florida Department of Business and Special Regulations, the short DPBR, they have stated shutdown of all American Legion posts in the state of Florida. Then rescinded that order, and then an email leaked out of their office that indicated they were going to enforce closure of all posts to include conducting any type of business. We feel this type of policy is overstepping the authority of the DPBR and has created even a greater financial burden on many of the posts within the state of Florida. As of now, July 14th, members of the American Legion have been told this too will be rescinded. However, some of the damage has already been done. Under what authority can the DPBR state that American Legion posts cannot meet or gather for business purposes under any circumstances and utilize the ABT to enforce such an order while the same email authorized cigar bars and like to be open for business?
Well, I think maybe part of the answer is to turn you into a cigar bar, right? But no, you know, I don't. I think that unfortunately, you know, it's a state agency, so I don't know. I don't have access to that email that you said was leaked or put out there or what have you. But I'll say a couple things about it. The first is I hope they do rescind it. And then obviously on top of the state restrictions or whatever your local county or cities are putting in place too, because that builds that they could create these restrictions on you. But I think there's a big difference between opening up a sort of commercial establishment where people regularly meet and a meeting place owned by and operated by a private, you know, not-for-profit organization for purposes of running its meetings and so forth. We can inquire through the governor's office of the DBPR and see exactly where it is they're coming from and whether in fact that rescission has been done. And then, you know, I still think you might face some issues with some cities and counties that are being more strict than others about who's allowed to meet where and what. And we'd love to, if that's an issue for you, we'd like to hear about those individual cases as well. But we'll reach out to DBPR and the governor's office and see where we are to at least give you some certainty on the state side of it.
Well, I appreciate it, Senator. We really do, because it really did cause a lot of confusion out here in the state of Florida. You know, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. One day yes, and the next day no. So thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
One of the founding principles of the American Legion is a strong national defense. Can you talk about initiatives you may be involved in to support strengthen our national defense initiatives? Also, during the recent government shutdowns, Project Debt Relief provided over 8,000 Florida Coast Guard members, and more importantly, the families helped sustain them until the shutdown ended. Nationally, the American Legion provided over $1 million in support of this effort, which also included a lot of support of those serving in Florida. What efforts are being made to ensure the Coast Guard will receive the paychecks they deserve during future shutdowns?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Coast Guard, you know, they're actually under the Commerce Department, so they're not even under the Department of Defense, which throws it for a loop there. I have no doubt they'll get paid. I mean, unfortunately, there's been this sort of breakup in the process, and it's something that we have a huge presence here in our state, and they serve a very important function, especially during these sorts of issues. So it'll be a priority for us. I personally know a lot of guardsmen who are in that situation. Going back to the broader question of the Department of Defense and our defenses, look, we're entering an era of, if you look at the challenges in the world, they all track back to one of 5 places. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and radical Islamic terror. Those are the five. If you look at any flashpoint in the world, you can link it back to one of those five. And so we've got to be prepared to defend against the threats that emerge from all five. Obviously, in the case of China, they've developed a lot of asymmetrical capabilities, and meaning, they probably aren't going to build 10 aircraft carriers, but they're going to build these rockets and missiles that can blow up an aircraft carrier and push us further away from being able to intervene in a situation over there. We've got to have a counter to it. In the case of Russia, they've begun to invest in their conventional weapons. I don't think they'll ever be at par where the Soviet Union was, but they have figured out a way to sort of do a lot of mayhem with little investment. And really, that's where I think NATO is an important alliance still. Obviously, we want our partners to do more, but NATO is a very important alliance. And then we've got to be able to defend against their informational warfare and cyber warfare capabilities. In the case of Iran, they've developed a pretty robust asymmetrical capability, these small speedboats that can swarm larger U.S. ships, the use of land limpet mines and things of that nature, and then their rocket capability, which is one of the biggest problems with the Iran deals that allow them to continue to build these rockets. And you've seen them already deployed, this mid-range missiles that can go 300-400 kilometers and become a threat to every one of our bases. So we have to have a counter to that. In the case of North Korea, obviously, they're a nuclear power at this point, and he's not going to invade anybody, but he uses it as a insurance policy. But you are worried that someone as unstable as that could eventually become either someone that's selling nuclear technology, or God forbid, in a moment of crisis, uses it against one of his neighbors. So that's why our alliance with Japan is so critical. And then we've had great success against radical terrorism. It still remains a big problem. And it's popping up in different places now. You see it sort of taking off in Africa and even in parts of Asia. So it's something we're going to have to continue to fight off, even as we focus on these four other things. And that's going to require investments in new technology and new capabilities. Whatever we start working on, the options available to a commander-in-chief a decade from now is going to be based on what we innovate and invest in today, which is why I think it's so important for America to preserve its manufacturing capability. You can't be a great power if you're not an industrial power. We've got to be able to make things, and that includes airframes and ships and tanks and all the other durable necessities for to be able to be a force that can project power on multiple continents and in two conflicts at the same time. And so we're right now working on the National Defense Authorization Act, which I think takes big steps towards strengthening some of these. But these are long-term investments that we're making in these technologies, and I think they'll pay dividends in the years to come.
Thank you, sir. During recent unrest throughout the United States, we have seen many monuments desecrated and destroyed. What initiatives are being worked on to protect these pieces of history?
Well, there's a couple things. The president signed an executive order that allows you to arrest them for a federal crime, and there have been upwards of 20 some odd arrests. I think that's had an impact already. I think the other thing is to remind everybody, nothing, you can change the name of whatever you want. You can argue, but there's a process for doing it. The process is you go before whatever the local authority is, be it the government, the federal government, local government, and you make your argument. People will vote on it and decide what they want to do, and so forth and so on. I mean, it is what it is. What you can't do is decide, I'm going to go in the street, I'm going to decide what I think is offensive, and I'm going to tear it down. And that you can't have. And that's what we've had. And sadly, we've had a lot of localities in this country where local authorities have either refused to do anything about it, and in some cases sort of cheered them on, or at least sort of excused it. And that's just not going to work. I mean, we just can't have the way to do that. And then I think in a broader context as a country, we need to understand history's complicated. If you look back 150 years, I just finished reading this great book. It talked about Congress during the Civil War. There was some incredible people in Congress during that time that had some ideas that at the time were radical. Things like allowing women to vote at that time. These are radical ideas, and the equality of the races. Then you had other people who were sort of very racist people, but they wanted to preserve the Union and end slavery nonetheless. History's complicated. Our standards today are very different than they were 100 some odd years ago. And that should be a source of pride for us. It shows our culture, our society, and our country has continued to progress. But what we can't, I think sometimes it's difficult to go back and ascribe today's sort of cultural norms and standards to the decisions people were making 200 or 300 years ago. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't say you don't go back and look at it. But a great, more contemporary example is what happened at the end of the Second World War. At the time, there wasn't a lot of debate in the U.S. about the use of atomic weapons in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Years later, there's more debate about it. But at the time, they were looking at literally hundreds of thousands of dead Americans if you had to invade the island and take Japan and end the war. And now, as we look back on it, not that you may disagree or agree with the decision, but we view it with a different lens. Is Truman next? Are we going to start tearing his name down on places because he made that decision? And that's why it's difficult to. I think part of understanding history is understanding the complexity of human beings, and none of them were perfect, and all of them, had made errors and mistakes in their lives, including Abraham Lincoln. He was actually not a very popular president for most of his presidency, and died within days of winning the Civil War. So I hope we can have that kind of conversation in this country again one day. It's tough to do right now, where there's a lot of yelling and screaming and craziness.
I sure hope so, Senator. Because our history is yesterday, our future is tomorrow.
Yes,
So
sir.
we have to continue to do that and look at that. And we learn from our history. So our state has a very large veteran population. What steps are you taking to improve the lives of our veterans? There are many with disabilities who can benefit from the sliding scale on property taxes versus percent of disability to increase workforce opportunities.
Well, obviously, on the issue of property taxes falls on states and local communities, so the federal government doesn't have much to do about that. But I think ultimately the sorts of things that there's two things that we were able to do earlier, and one of them is to ask the Veteran Affairs Department we passed a bill that requires them to be much more proactive in sort of identifying job and entrepreneurial opportunities for veterans as they exit service, and both sort of taking an exit strategy for them, whereas you assess the skills they've developed while in service and see if you can't match them up with an industry or an employer, provide them guidance in that direction, or entrepreneurial opportunities for people who have that skill set. So we've mandated by law now that the VA sort of establish a program to do that. And I think that's going to be very helpful. And then in a broader context, there's a significant percentage of veterans who own small businesses, and so that's why what we did on PPP is so important, because it allowed small businesses to be able to provide payroll and some funding at a time when the bottom had fallen out on everybody. And we're actually going back on Monday, and over the next 3 weeks, we'll work on the next phase of that. There'll be a second phase of that sort of assistance for small businesses that are still being hurt. And veterans are a disproportionate part of that as well. So we think that program, we won't know the numbers on veteran-owned businesses until the forgiveness process, but we have reason to believe it's quite high and representative of the role they play in the small business sector.
Yes, it is, sir. One last question. I know you're a busy man. This come up a lot during our initial asking questions to you. Is the Republican National Convention coming to Florida really a good thing for Florida given our rise in COVID numbers? And what will the positive financial impact on the state of Florida by having the Republican National Convention in Jacksonville?
Well, anytime you bring people from out of town, they're going to stay in hotel rooms and pay that tax and provide revenue for local government. So all of that is a positive. Obviously, the challenge is you don't want it to become a vector for infections that ultimately, when you bring people in from all over the place, they could be bringing that virus and then infecting Floridians who are left behind to deal with the consequences of it. Look, the RNC is continuing to take steps to make that event as safe as possible. They've announced they're going to scale it down. They're looking to do the events outdoors, which is a big, it's not impossible to get infected outdoors, but the chances are dramatically diminished when you're outdoors. They're going to be testing every participant. So I think I've told people, if you want 3 or 4 free COVID tests, become a delegate to the convention, because they're going to test everybody on the way in every day. So, that's going to be a pretty well-screened group. So, and then obviously they're going to require all the local things with the masks and so forth. So when you add all that up together, outdoors, scaled down events, everybody tested, I think generally speaking, you should feel pretty good that those are pretty strong mitigation measures. Look, this is not going to be like any of the other conventions. I think when it's all said and done, it's going to basically be an outdoor Trump rally. That's what it's going to kind of look like. And so we'll see how that plays out. But look, it was going to be somewhere, and it's going to be in Florida, and it'll have some positive impact on us.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. And we appreciate it. And Senator, I appreciate all your time. I appreciate you doing this webinar with us. This is our first one we've ever done like this. And it looks like that this is going to be part of our future right here, is doing things like this where we can get together and talk about certain issues. So
Yeah, no, I look forward to coming back.
Well, we'll definitely invite you back. I want you to tell one thing to JR, your buddy there. Tell him thank you for getting involved in this. He's always involved with us at the American Legion. He does stuff by the department all the time. He's a very, very good advocate for us, and so are you. And we appreciate your time. We appreciate your concern about our veterans in Florida. And sir, just continue to do what you're doing, and thank you for who you are. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate the time you've given me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You have a good day.
You
Bye.
too. Stay safe.
You too.